Most AI governance is a policy document that nobody enforces. The EU AI Act is changing that. The FTC is changing that. US courts are already changing that. 145,000 in AI hallucination sanctions against lawyers in Q1 2026 alone, with the judiciary making clear that accountability attaches to the organization, not the tool. Today's guest didn't wait for regulators to force the issue. He built compliance into the architecture from day one, and it cut his compute cost by significantly in that process. That's what governance first actually looks like. Welcome to Data Science with Sam. This is the final episode of season 3. I'm your host, Sam, and my today's guest is Dan Driver, founder of Driver AI Agency and architect of CaseReady Intake AI. Dan started his career at DuPont, where Six Sigma and ISO frameworks shaped how he thinks about every system he touches. Over 25 years, he moved from frontline SDR to managing tens of millions in annual revenue. Always a problem solver first. When he navigated the EEOC employment discrimination process twice without an attorney, he identified the 3 pillars every case depends on: narrative, evidence, and timetable. And that led him to build CaseReady, a governance-first legal AI product built to restore agency to people facing discrimination at the exact moment it's been taken from them. Dan, welcome to the show. I'm very happy to have you here.
Sam, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor.
Thanks, Dan. And before we dive into the Q&A section, I would like to remind our listeners to please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, Data Science with Sam. If you like listening to any of my episodes, don't forget to share that with your network. And my team always open for new ideas and topics. So feel free to connect with us if you'd like to share your story over my podcast platform. Now back to the Q&A section. Let's start at the origin, Dan, because the backstory here is genuinely unusual. As you mentioned, you built compliance infrastructure for a legal tech product. Walk us through that origin. How did a non-lawyer like you ended up architecting governance controls for a legal AI system?
Well, Sam, you hit it right on the head. I mean, I'm not an attorney and I'm not a developer by trade. And CaseReady AI Intake was basically developed from a lived experience of navigating two employment discrimination claims pro se and or what is self-representative in the eyes of the law. And that's how CaseReady Intake AI was developed, was from the lived experience that I went through and myself saying there must be a better way. And I created a tool that is something I wish I had from the beginning.
Thanks, Dan. Let's move on to the second question. Most startups build first and bolt on compliance later. But you flipped the model. Governance constraints were the starting point for your architecture. So what does that actually look like in the practice? Could you please walk us through your thought process when you are building the architecture?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, with a background working with DuPont and exposure to Six Sigma and ISO when it was just starting, these are things that have kind of guided a lot of my process thinking going forward. And so how that translated into CaseReady Intake AI is I have a 10-page charter that every AI decision is audited or able to be audited by anyone. And in the case of governance in motion, if you will, before launch, doing a audit for UPL exposure, the unlicensed practice of law, which I cannot do. Things were discovered that delayed my launch date. And I had a critical reason for picking the launch date that I did. But as a result of this audit and this 10-page charter, I missed my launch date by 2 weeks. But I had to do that to be in compliance with UPL. So the other thing it does for me, though, is every architectural decision that is implemented, it is documented. The idea is a human in the loop then can be audited. So the decision that was made, when it was made, why it was made. And all of that is logged. And then the 10-page charter also created a series of tests that anytime a product is deployed, a new revision is deployed, it has to be tested against all of those before the deployment goes live.
Got it. So this kind of like sounds like the governance was not just a layer added on top of your product. It was basically the skeleton the rest of the architecture was built around. And that's a
Is-
fundamentally kind of like the design philosophy. Probably all the AI technology products in the governance and compliance area should follow, because you have to think about the compliance for it. And I think that is probably the message that we are trying to provide to our listeners of this episode.
On the
Thanks, Dan.
industry,
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
the industry that I came from was heavily regulated, either
Uh,
heavily regulated or highly technological. And so I saw an opportunity here
mhm.
because the AI industry is largely unregulated, although Colorado, even just last Friday, had some changes to SB 205. By building to that standard, to me, it was like building to an ANSI safety glass standard. There are certain facilities you can't get in unless you have an ANSI rated safety glass. Well, as those types of standards become more prevalent in AI and governance and architecture, these things will only become more readily adopted. So I'm glad we're having that conversation to help further it.
Definitely. And it's definitely resonate with my thoughts, because someone like me also worked in the highly regulated environment in most part of my life, as because of my background in healthcare and pharmaceutical area. So I totally agree with you on that. So now for my listeners, this is where the stakes get concrete, because in legal tech, a hallucinated case citation is not just a wrong answer. It's a
Right.
potential sanctions event. And that brings me to my third question. Like in legal tech, hallucinated case citation, like I mentioned, it's kind of had a really consequences for a user, right? So how do these deterministic controls eliminate hallucination risk? You probably kind of build some of these controls while building your architecture. So could you please just walk us through, our listeners, that how some of those controls could eliminate or even mitigate the hallucination risk in any AI products?
It's as you touched on it, language of deterministic, and we're using language, or I apologize, Python, for deterministic language to decide either a yes or no, a pass or fail. Before the LLM is ever asked to, actually, the LLM is never asked to calculate dates. It's all done through Python, and Python can affirm us back a positive or a negative answer or no answer, which in this case is also an answer within the system. And the LLM is never left alone with a surface that can create legal exposure. It cannot hallucinate because I've got Python controls on the front end and on the back end. And it will say, hey, this is out of scope. An example of this in action would be calculating dates and to be able to give a warning to someone. Hey, did you aware this happened 10 years ago?
Yep. No, definitely. And you touched upon the deterministic check, and I wanted to elaborate a little bit for our listeners who are probably from a technology background or even AI background. For me, I could tell that I learned AI before AI became cool because of, all this LLM and ChatGPT revolution. So there are a lot of people missing the point that when they're going to use AI versus when they are not going to use AI. Like you mentioned, Dan, the deterministic check, we do not have to use LLM when you're doing a deterministic check. The automation, keeping human in the loop, or any scripting process, whether it's Python or any other programming language driven, could solve the purpose. LLM is there to put a wrapper on that. That's going to give us more of like a holistic overview based on the deterministic checks. And I'm glad that you built a system around it that's kind of not only just mitigating some of the hallucination risk, but also keeping the traditional deterministic checks in the loop. So humans are still in the control, which is exactly aligns with the governance and compliance objectives nowadays. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for sharing that insights. It's going to give a better overview of your architecture to our listeners. Now, since we mentioned hallucination, my next question has to be something related to prompt injection, which is another famous term that's resurfaced in the last few years due to LLM evolution. Now, prompt injection, for some of our listeners, is one of the most underappreciated attack surfaces in production AI. So, in your opinion, can you break down what your runtime QA layer does and what would have happened without it in legal context, where user inputs can be adversarial or could be kind of like controlled by some sort of a prompt injection or external, like a hacking attempt?
With CaseReady Intake and the way the pipeline is set up, one of the last phases is an AI check that says, okay, compared to the initial input and about what we're about ready to output here, does this make sense? And again, the Python is looking for some deterministic language for a go, no go decision. Because if somebody is asking it for legal advice and trying to prompt it to give them legal advice, it's going to fail. It's not going to be able to do that for them. And that's one of the things the final LLM is also checking for is, does this output make sense to the charter? Does it make sense to CaseReady Intake AI's what we're producing here, a narrative, a timeline, and a list of evidence? If it's not those items, it's instructions for Michael Jordan eating a pizza. Fail.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like, predefining some rule base or some rule books that's going to help your system to, define some of the criteria beforehand. And you don't have to kind of use AI all the time, which kind of like brings me to my next question in terms of utilization of the compute cost. Because you mentioned to me that, you made one architectural decision that cut per call compute cost by over 99%, which is significant, especially if running a legal company or organization, and if I'm going to in-house your product, I would definitely consider how much money I'm going to spend on LLM tokens, if I implement your system. So I think that's a kind of one of the very burning topic right now, because organizations are trying to figure out how they're going to minimize LLM token cost and get maximum throughput out of the AI system. Without giving away the full playbook, what was the class of decision that drove that, and how does cost architecture intersect with compliance requirements in your product, or even some of the practices that you build using AI so far?
In the compliance aspect, that Python calculator that we talked about earlier in your second question, it relates to this one again as well. So in the workflow, the very first thing it does is what's called what we call a pre-flight check. And the LLM is using a Boolean filter to look for some specific dates. And I apologize, it's using a regenerative expression, I believe it is, to find those dates. Still sharpening all my Python terms. Like I said, I'm not a developer by trade. But what it's doing is it finds a date. And before any instruction is ever sent to the LLM to start working on the narrative, it determines, is this in scope or does a warning need to be thrown? And then the warning is thrown to the end user. So what this means is, instead of the AI computing the entirety and burning the tokens and the money and so on and so forth, to basically parse out, hey, this whole deal is out of scope. We use a Python deterministic control on the front end to determine if this is in scope or out of scope. If it's out of scope, throw a warning. Then the person has to make a decision whether they want to proceed or back up. And that simple decision, by having that Python date check right at the front door, is what drives the cost of compute down so far, because it doesn't have to do the entire LLM. It just looks for the date first and then asks the user, do you want to proceed?
No, I definitely like that aspect. And if I put my, I would say, AI architecture or any like a technology architecture cap on, I do see that there is a fair bit of like value addition with having that extra decision layer sitting on top of that AI. Because at the end of the day, I mean, when we're dealing with the compliance and governance, we have to keep human involved in every part of decision making process. So a human would kind of like consider not going with that AI decision making process right at the beginning. That's definitely gonna help with not burning like computing cost and stuff, especially like the LLM token system, which are sometimes proven to be expensive if you're using high standard model like a Opus 4.7 and stuff compared to like a low scale models. So yeah, that's I would say a very smart architecture decision. And in my pool, like the listeners who are actually from the architect background, they could definitely resonate that with thought process of how we can mitigate some of the computational cost by making smart decision right at the beginning of the life cycle of the process. Now, moving on, Driver AI Agency is building tools that empower people and restore human control, like keeping human in the loop and stuff, especially in the legal services, which is essential. Why is legal tech such a powerful domain for proving out responsible AI? What does it force you to get right that other verticals let you skip? Like, why did you start with the legal industry vertical as opposed to finance or healthcare or any other domains?
Or sales, or any
Or yeah.
of the others. Yeah, that, where my background is in. It's as a result of lived experience. It's having this thrust on me. It's hundreds of hours working on my own 2 cases. And when a person faces discrimination or retaliation, there is the very real threat of job loss, or if they haven't already lost it. So it's a really emotional time and it's hard to think clearly. And that's what CaseReady Intake AI does, is the person's sense of agency is taken from them because of things being done to them that are beyond their control. Well, CaseReady Intake AI returns that sense of agency to them by providing to them what I, in my bio, talked about a coordinate system to use my prior career in GIS, because it provides the narrative, timeline, and the list of evidence. And with those three items, that's your base architecture. Those are your core coordinates. And from there, with that information, the person's sense of agency is returned and they can make effective decisions whether they're going to go file with the EEOC, work with an attorney from there, or just use it for their own edification of this is all of the information that I need to this point.
Yeah. No, thank you,
And
Dan.
can I
And
add one other thing on that though, Sam? The AI and the ABA doesn't care how good the AI is. They
Mhm.
just care about whether I'm practicing law or not.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say in my own way is that the legal industry was essentially a pressure test for your product. Like if your governance architecture holds in legal, it holds anywhere. I
Yes.
mean, and if it doesn't, then legal is where you find out the hard way. And it's kind of easier for you to leverage that in other industry verticals. So you just started with the toughest one. So I hope.
And I was fortunate to have a
Mhm,
framework with
mhm.
SB 205. It told me some things to build toward. Again, coming from a background of either highly regulated or highly technical industries, I knew what to build going into this because of my lived experience. It produces predictable, defensible, auditable outputs every single time. And no hallucinations. And that's what you have to have. But there's also other anti-biasing testing that needs to take place as a part of SB 205. There are many other things, but I don't know. It just felt comfortable.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. And since you mentioned about the SP to the framework, I would
Mhm.
definitely ask you to maybe share some materials and links around that particular framework or the governance policies that I can share with our listeners, and I'll be happy to put that down in the YouTube or even the podcast vlog description. I would definitely encourage our listeners to go through the framework and just get themselves educated with that policy that Dan mentioned.
I will be happy to share that. As a matter of fact, on Friday, Sam, I think we were talking about it just a little bit. There was some changes to it, a little bit of softening, but AI tools that will be performing in high stakes areas like legal will still have the same, nothing changed for that lane.
Yeah, no, that's definitely good information for especially the industry leaders listening to this episode because, like you mentioned, this framework is gonna probably vary from industry to industry. However, we still gonna have a lot of guardrails, and that won't change. So anybody building AI products or even part of the AI implementation government should be up to date with those kind of policies and stuff because it's gonna change rapidly in future as well.
Well, and as long as we start having these conversations and driving the conversation around some type of governance and audible trails, because we can't have hallucinations in high stakes
Yeah.
environments, it just
Now, you
can't.
mentioned about governance, and I did touch upon a little bit of enterprise related stuff. So that actually brings me to my next question. So, most AI enterprise AI governance, to be precise, is policies in a PDF file. You have built it into the architecture itself. Where do you see companies getting AI governance most wrong? And what's the minimum viable governance stack for your team shipping AI to end users? Just give your honest and blunt answers to it because I'm pretty sure tons of industry leaders listening to this episode would love to know about what's they're doing wrong and how they can make that right.
Well, I would say from a governance standpoint and just a PDF file, having a policy on AI and not allowing it doesn't eliminate it. It only creates shadow IT and security risks. I mean, it makes the risks invisible then because the employer doesn't really know, hey, what is the tool being used? Governance has to be more than a document. It has to be governance in motion. An example of that in CaseReady Intake AI and what that looks like. Although I'm an individual operator, with that charter that I put in place, I wind up doing all the manual pull requests in GitHub. That's the human in the loop. That process could be automated. I could have Claude do that, could have Claude Code do that. But I do that as a double check also on the documentation of the instructions. Are they in place? Are they correct for what they should be? And again, the goal being building an auditable trail. So anybody could step in at any time and be able to look at it, know who made the decision, why the decision was made, when the decision was made. Pardon me.
Totally agree with you on that. Now, we are kind of getting towards the business end of this podcast episode. And like we started the discussion talking about your agency, Driver AI. So I would like to go back to that. So, what's the vision for Driver AI agency over the next, let's say, 1 to 2 years? And where do you see the intersection of legal tech and AI governance heading as regulation starts to catch up with the technology, especially the innovation that we're seeing as a part of generative AI?
As we talked about, CaseReady Intake AI, a product of Driver AI agency, just launched earlier this month. I have 150 to 200 targeted users. Apologize, Sam. There it is again. The dog. Can you hear it?
Yep. Go ahead, please.
I apologize to the listeners. Launched earlier this month with CaseReady Intake AI, and the goal is 150 paying users for this year to work on possible plug-in partnerships with companies like Clio, Eve Legal, are just two of the big names out there. There is a new launch with Anthropic called Courtroom 5. That is more of a competitor, but it's also a huge validation into what I've just recently deployed here. Theirs is more of a blunt sword, if you will, where case-ready intake AI is highly specific. Might have partnership plug-in opportunities. To get back to your question, this might be my Colonel Sanders moment. Might not be as lucrative, but this might be my shot.
Okay. I mean, that's definitely fascinating. But that brings me to the last question for you is that, like you mentioned, that Anthropic launched this Claude for legal this week. So is it a plan to integrate that system with your product, or you just going to get influenced, or I would say more of like a taking that Claude for legal, that tool as more of like a benchmark platform to test it against your product? How does it is going to pan out for you next, let's say, couple of weeks? How are you going to plan on testing that out?
I plan on reaching out to their head of their legal team. He was featured on the podcast, Mark, and was talking about that legal is one of the most active business verticals in Claude. And so it was total validation for the specific tool that I built here. They have pathways to market to become a plugin, if I understand it correctly, with them that maybe case-ready intake AI has a role in. Maybe the role right now, I'm a customer-facing product. I built this for the user like myself, for someone who is navigating these waters on their own. It can be an intake agent for an attorney firm, again, with the human in the loop idea for auditing always. If anything, Anthropic moving into this area is extreme validation for the tool that I've built. I'm in the right place in the right time, and it's not by accident.
Yep. No, definitely. I mean, like you said, and quoting you, is that it's actually a great use case for AI implementation. Otherwise, Claude and Anthropic wouldn't have come into this uncharted territory. And it seems like that's an opportunity, more of an opportunity for Driver AI agency to kind of like either partner with Claude, Anthropic in future, or even at least do some integration collaboration that's going to take your product to the next level. And it's and I'm excited to see how that partnership work, how Anthropic is gonna approach you, because you thought through this, that this is something have a market for AI implementation in the legal tech world. So your vision is definitely aligned with where we're heading, and it seems like Anthropic's new product kind of like a, I would say, a proof of testament for that.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, so it's fascinating, and I know we are kind of like coming towards the end of this episode. But before we wrap up, I would like to ask you, Dan, that is there any message or any advice that you want to give to my listeners who would like to kind of like utilize or test the AI strategies or even AI implementation in the legal or the AI governance world? I mean, why do they start? I mean, do you have any advice as such?
Well, In my case, I can only speak to my experience in my lane, and that is I'm not an attorney. So for me, the critical nature is UPL, unlicensed practice of law, and I cannot cross that line. So case ready strength is that it is structured thinking in high stakes environments without being a lawyer. It's not just what it produces, but what it doesn't produce, what it doesn't do. And that's what its strengths are. And that is what I would like to share with the listeners as far as their interest in CaseReady Intake AI, but also using Python deterministic controls and regenerative expressions and Boolean filters and many of these other programming terms that I have tertiary knowledge of. Again, I'm not a programmer, but I'm learning them. That these very much play a part in an effective AI deployed tool. And AI can't just operate on its own. Guardrails aren't enough when you're dealing with legal. They have to be hard walls that it cannot cross. And that's where the
Yep.
deterministic language that you can use Python for.
Thanks, Dan. How do my listeners find you? I mean, would you mind, just giving some sort of your contact information over the podcast? I will also share that in the notes, but they probably would like to hear from you first.
Yes, please. I welcome anybody interested to reach out to me via LinkedIn. My contact information is there. It's admin at Driver AI Agency is my email address. It's Driver AI Agency is the website. You'll also find me on LinkedIn under Dan Driver, Driver, just like the occupation. Either miss my calling, but the contact information there is on LinkedIn.
Thanks, Dan. It was wonderful hosting you for this episode. I think this has been one of the most technically rigorous, coupled with governance related topic conversations I have had on this show for a while. Thank you for your contribution, your time. Driver AI Agency and Case Ready Intake AI are linked in the show notes. Please check that out. The governance first architecture Dan has described is the framework I would definitely be studying for in next few weeks. I would definitely encourage my listeners to go check out Driver AI Agency as well and get yourself acquainted with the framework. And please feel free to contact Dan via LinkedIn. If you like this episode, I would definitely encourage you to please subscribe to my YouTube channel and the other podcast platform where this episode will be available in an audio format. And I will see you in the next episode, which is going to be the first one for my season 4. So stay tuned and see you in the next one. Thank you.
Bye, Sam.